Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another Victober video. And today I thought I would tell you a little bit about how I discover new Victorian books to read. I thought this might be an interesting video to make, just telling you a little bit about how I find out about Victorian books, how I discover Victorian books and how you might too. I don't know how much of this will be useful tips and how much of this will just be interesting, but I guess we will see. Hopefully me telling you a little bit about how I find new Victorian books to read might let you know how you can find more too. Because as we know, I do read a lot of Victorian literature and I have now got to the point where I'm reading quite obscure Victorian literature that you don't necessarily just automatically know about or hear about as much from other people. So the first way I definitely hear about a lot of Victorian books is through BookTube. I watch a lot of BookTubers and a lot of the BookTubers who I watch like Victorian literature. There are so many BookTubers who I find out about Victorian books from. I get lots of recommendations for books and authors who I haven't got to yet from watching other people's BookTube videos. I did a video a while back with recommendations for BookTubers who like Victorian literature, which I'll link down below. But a few of my favourite BookTubers who like Victorian literature, who I get a lot of recommendations from, are Kate Howe and Lucy the Reader, of course, the other two Victober hosts. And I'd also really recommend Jenny from Bookish Shenanigans, Marissa from Blatantly Bookish, Jennifer Brooks and Claudia from Spencer's Library. All of those booktubers read a lot of classics, including Victorian literature, and I've got many great recommendations from. I would say the booktuber who I get the most recommendations from for obscure Victorian literature that I've never heard of is Kate Howe. Kate reads a lot of Victorian books and discovers a lot of Victorian books that I've never heard of, and I get so many great recommendations from her. So if you are looking for more obscure Victorian reads, then Kate is someone you absolutely need to watch. Another way that I often find out about Victorian books, or certainly the way in which I definitely used to find out about Victorian books when I was a teenager, is through recommendations from family and friends, and especially from family who are older. There are quite a lot of Victorian books which are not very famous now, but like used to be more famous like 30 years ago. So a lot of the Victorian books I read as a teenager were recommended to me by my mum, and I got a lot of recommendations for Victorian literature through sort of parents and grandparents and relations who had read those books when they were younger, when they were slightly more famous than they are now. Especially, you know, some of the more obscure like Wilkie Collins and George Gissing books were slightly more famous in the kind of the mid to late 20th century than they are now, and so I got a lot of recommendations when I was a teenager for those books and discovered a lot of new Victorian authors from getting recommendations from older family members. Another way that I often discover Victorian books to read is by looking into lesser well-known works by well-known Victorian authors. A lot of Victorian authors were incredibly prolific, and you might have heard of one or two books by an author but none of the rest. For example, I'm pretty sure everyone who has any interest in the Victorian period has heard of Thomas Hardy, but I reckon the vast majority of people who've heard of Thomas Hardy have heard of Tess the D'Urbervilles, Judy Obscure and Far from the Madding Crowd, but I reckon most of them have not heard of The Hand of Ethelberta. If you discover a new Victorian author and you like them, the chances are they wrote a lot of books. There are some Victorian authors like the Brontes and Gaskell and George Eliot who didn't write that many books, but Thomas Hardy and Dickens wrote 14 novels each, Anthony Trollope wrote 47, Mary Elizabeth Braddon and Margaret Oliphant both wrote between like 80 and 100 books. I can never remember which way round that is. Like, the Victorians were very prolific. So if there's a Victorian author that you've heard of but you've already read their most famous book, chances are they've written tons of other books, and that is one of the ways that I find a lot of the new Victorian books that I read. You know, I discovered Anthony Trollope a long time ago. I read 2 of his books when I was a teenager, but I'm still only I think 27 or 28 books into his 47 book total. So, you know, there's a lot of Anthony Trollope books for me to read. As far as I'm concerned, I'm very unlikely to ever run out of Victorian literature to read because the Victorians were so prolific. And one of the ways in which I mostly discover new Victorian books to read is by looking into more obscure works by the authors that I already know and love. Another way that I of course find out about Victorian books and classics in general is through publishers' lists. There are a lot of wonderful publishers who publish a lot of different classics. So I'll start off with talking about some more mainstream publishers, and then I'll talk about a few ones who publish like more obscure classics. So obviously I really love Penguin Classics. I talk about this a lot. I think the last video on this channel was me telling you about all my Penguin Classics, but Penguin Classics have a wonderful collection and they're a really good way to find out about Victorian literature. If you look through their catalogue and what Victorian books they publish, you can find out about a lot of books, some of which you might have heard of, some of which you might not have heard of. Another publisher that has a really wonderful range is Oxford World Classics. I like the typeface slightly less in Oxford World Classics than Penguin Classics, which is the reason why I tend to collect Penguin Classics more, but Oxford World Classics have a really good range. Like, they have a fantastic range for Anthony Trollope. They have a lot of the more obscure Anthony Trollops, which I really like. They've got a lot of classics in general and a lot of Victorian books. Looking through their online catalogue and seeing what books they publish is a really great way to find out about Victorian books. Another publisher that does a lot of Victorian books is the Pam Macmillan Collectors Library. I really like the design of these and the fact that they are really little, and they've got a lot of great Victorian books. So looking through their online catalogue, again, is another way to find out about new works. And then there are also lots of publishers out there who focus on finding and publishing more obscure works. So I would like to quickly mention Persephone Books. Persephone Books are a wonderful publisher of out-of-print classics. They are mostly focused on 20th century classics, but they do have a few Victorian books amongst their list. So this is The Mystery of Mrs. Glencarrow by Margaret Oliphant, and I've also got Reuben Sachs by Amy Levy, both of which are wonderful Victorian books that I had never heard of and that I found through stumbling across them on Persephone's website. And once I read these, I discovered two new Victorian authors who I really like, and I've read more books by them since. I've read another book by Amy Levy. She only wrote 2 novels, but Margaret Oliphant, after having read The Mystery of Mrs. Glencarrow, which I loved, I've read, I don't know, 6 or 7 of her books since then, most of which I've read on Kindle because they're out of print. But it's through reading this book originally that I discovered her as an author and found out like so many more amazing books to read. I love Margaret Oliphant so much, and I wouldn't have discovered her if it wasn't for this Persephone classic. I'd also really recommend Honno Press. Honno Press are an independent publisher in Wales, and they have a list of forgotten Welsh classics, mostly by female writers. So here I have 2 books by Amy Dilwyn, Jill and the Rebecca Rioter, both of which I really enjoyed, especially Jill. I love Jill. These are wonderful, wonderful books. I heard about Honno Press first, I think through Leanne Rose, whose channel I'll link down below. I think that's where I first heard about Honno Press. And from discovering them as a publisher, I discovered Amy Dilwyn as a writer who I love, so I'm very, very grateful to them for that. And they are a really wonderful publisher that is definitely worth looking into. Then this book here is The Romance of a Shop by Amy Levy, which I bought because I read and enjoyed Reuben Sachs by Amy Levy. And having got this, I can see that Black Apollo Press do publish several other obscure, forgotten Victorian books in their Victorian series, which I really want to buy. I haven't yet, but I'd really like to. So they seem like a really interesting publisher too, who do publish more obscure, completely forgotten Victorian books. Like the 2 other books in their series that are advertised in the back that I'm eyeing up are In Darkest London by Margaret Harkness and Children of the Ghetto by Israel Zangwill, and neither of which I'd ever heard of before, so very excited to read them and to read a bit more from Black Apollo Press. Finally, I did want to mention the Hard Press Classic series. So this is a slightly more complicated one because it's a bit harder to find what books are in these editions, but what Hard Press do is reprint out-of-print classics in like a photocopied form, so you can see it's not like the most legible writing ever, but they are quite reliable for producing kind of obscure classics in a physical form that have gone out of print, so I really like them as well, and I always look out for them. If I see a book available on that cover, I know that they are pretty reliable too. It is worth mentioning as well that a lot of Victorian classics are available for free online, either through like Amazon Kindle or through Project Gutenberg. Because nearly everything from the Victorian period is now out of copyright, you can get free digital editions of a lot of Victorian books. And that's the way that I read a lot of the Victorian books that I read. I read a lot of obscure Victorian books on Kindle because they're free, and often, you know, these books that were published a really long time ago, if they're more obscure, they're not in print anymore, but it is very easy to make a digital version accessible, so you can have access to them online. So once you've found a book, if it's obscure and you can't get a physical copy, you might find you are able to read it in a digital form, which is something that I really enjoy. Another way that I find out about new Victorian books and authors is from references in other Victorian books. The Victorians were a bit meta sometimes, and they do like to reference other Victorian books in their books, both through, you know, conversations where characters are talking about the books that they like to read, but also quite a few Victorian books George Eliot does this a lot. I feel like Gaskell sometimes does it, and Charlotte Mary Young does it in The Heir of Redcliffe. They start each chapter with like a little epigraph with a quote from a poem or like an extract from a work that they like. And often if you look those up, they will be Victorian writers too, and you can see kind of who people are in conversation with, which is really interesting. So that's a kind of interesting way to discover new Victorian books as well. You know, see how Victorian books reference each other. And on a kind of similar note, you can also find out about new Victorian authors and books through like looking at periodicals. This is like very obscure and specific. But a while ago I looked up Household Words, which was a literary magazine during the Victorian period that Charles Dickens edited and published. And I was able to find online a list of all the authors who had contributed to the Christmas editions of Household Words. And so through that I was able to find out about a lot of Victorian authors who were publishing in literary journals and magazines at that time, many of whom I'd heard of. You know, Gaskell and Wilkie Collins and Harriet Martineau all contributed to Household Words, but I also found the names of a lot of Victorian authors who I'd never heard of, who I'm really curious to find out a bit more about in the future. And I also often find out about Victorian authors and their novels through non-fiction about the Victorian period. If I'm reading history books about the Victorian period, a lot of them do use Victorian novels as sources, partly, you know, for sources of how everyday life was, but also for sources of like, you know, how people thought you should behave in the Victorian period, because novels, that they don't always tell you how people lived, they often tell you how people thought they should live or how people thought they lived, which is really interesting. So a lot of history books about the Victorian period do use Victorian fiction as primary sources. So by reading non-fiction about the Victorian period by historians such as Judith Flanders and Ruth Goodman, I have discovered lots of new Victorian books that I hadn't heard of before. Another very, very good resource for finding out about Victorian books is a website called victorianweb.org. This is a website on which I spent many an hour during my teenage years and still spend lots of time. It is an incredibly wonderful resource with tons of articles and sources about the Victorian period as a whole, and also a lot about Victorian literature, and it has tons of articles and lists and you know, critical reviews and just a lot of information about Victorian literature and Victorian books. It also has on it lists of bestsellers during the Victorian period, which is, you know, fascinating and really useful for finding out about Victorian books. But it also has all these interesting articles that talk about Victorian literature and might introduce you to a few books that you haven't heard of before. So Victorian Web is a website I would completely recommend if you're interested in finding out about more Victorian literature. And finally, like other general online research is another way that I find out about a lot of Victorian books. So for example, if I'm interested in reading a Victorian book on a particular theme, I might just Google that and see what I find. When I was like prepping for that video I made a few years ago called Disability and Deformity in Victorian Literature, I Googled like Victorian literature featuring characters with disabilities, and that was how I stumbled across Olive by Dinah Mulock-Craik, which is now one of my favourite Victorian books of all time. Like looking up Victorian books with a theme or a particular element that you are interested in is a good way to find new Victorian books, and especially more obscure ones that you might not find in mainstream places but that academics have written about because they're interesting. Often you can just find them on Google. Many of my favourite Victorian books I've just found out by Googling. And there we go, those are the general ways that I find out about Victorian books. Some of these ways I know are very obvious, but I hope this has nonetheless been a helpful video. Please do let me know down in the comments what are the main ways you find out about new classics to read. And that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.